Hey everyone, welcome back. We're diving deep today. You ready?
Always ready to dive in.
Perfect. So today's deep dive is on a topic that's, I think, on everyone's mind, the Russia-Ukraine conflict. And we received so many sources from you all, and it's clear you want to go beyond just the headlines, right? When we really understand the nuances of what's happening.
Definitely. It's a complex situation, and I think a lot of people are looking for that deeper understanding. Especially when you're bombarded with so much information from so many different sources, sometimes it's hard to sort through it all.
Absolutely. So you sent us expert analyses, historical accounts, even reports from people on the ground, soldiers, medics. And we're going to try to make sense of it all together, right? But before we even jump into the current situation, I think it's crucial to grasp the historical backdrop.
Definitely. Context is everything. You can't understand the present without understanding the past. Right?
Exactly. And one thing that really struck me from the sources, something I hadn't fully grasped before, is how long Ukraine was under Russian or Soviet control.
Oh yeah, it's a significant part of their history. We're talking about 337 years. From 1667 to 1991. That's practically their entire modern history.
Wow, 337 years. That's almost unfathomable to think about it. But then in 1991, when the Soviet Union collapses, Ukraine votes overwhelmingly for independence, right? Over 90% in a referendum.
Yeah, it was a landslide vote. And it really demonstrates, the desire for self-determination that Ukrainians felt. They wanted to forge their own path.
It makes you realize this isn't just some recent territorial dispute. There's centuries of history intertwined here, right?
Exactly. For Ukrainians, this is about reclaiming their agency, their right to decide their own destiny. But for Russia, losing Ukraine, a country so deeply connected to their history and culture, well, it was a major blow.
And that historical context, I think, helps us understand why this conflict is so emotionally charged on both sides.
Absolutely. It's not just about geopolitics. It's about identity, history, and a sense of belonging.
Right. Okay, so beyond that deep historical connection, there's also the issue of NATO expansion, right? One source mentioned promises made to Russia in the early 90s, assuring them that NATO wouldn't expand eastward.
Yeah, not 1 inch eastward. That was the phrase used by U.S. Secretary of State James Baker back then. These assurances were seen as critical to maintaining stability after the Cold War.
Not 1 inch eastward, and yet, when you look at a map today, what do you see? NATO's right on Russia's borders.
Right, and that's a major point of contention for Russia. They view this expansion as encirclement, a direct threat to their security. From their perspective, the West broke a promise and betrayed their trust.
And I think that sense of betrayal, that feeling of being cornered, plays a huge role in how Russia's approaching this conflict.
For sure. It feeds into their narrative, They see it as the West encroaching on their sphere of influence, trying to contain them.
Then, to make things even more complicated, you have the 2014 Maidan coup. A pro-Russian president is ousted, and it really seems like a turning point in the relationship between Russia and the West.
Yeah, it was a major escalation. Russia viewed the Maidan revolution, which did have Western support, as a direct attempt to undermine their influence and pull Ukraine into the Western orbit.
And it's interesting because you even sent over this audio clip where a foreign policy expert is being interviewed by Stephen Colbert, and he openly admits to America's role in pushing Ukraine towards the West. Not something you hear every day on late-night TV.
Right. It's a good example of how perceptions of the same event can vary wildly, right?
Yeah.
And it demonstrates just how complex these international dynamics are. There's a lot going on behind the scenes.
Definitely. And then, as if things weren't tense enough, we have the closure of the gas pipeline that runs through Ukraine to Europe. Talk about upping the ante in the economic warfare that's been going on.
Huge move with major implications. Now Europe's looking at higher gas prices, and they're more dependent on the U.S. for energy, which strengthens America's position globally, and for Russia. Their economy, which is already struggling under sanctions, takes another hit.
It's almost like every move in this conflict has ripple effects, right? It impacts the political landscape, the global economy, everything.
Exactly. This isn't just a regional conflict. It has global consequences.
Right, and it's those global consequences, I think, that have a lot of people worried, especially when you consider what we learned from some of the sources about those soldiers going AWOL.
Yeah, that Ukrainian brigade trained in France, and a significant number just disappeared before they even saw combat. 1,700 of them, to be exact.
1,700 soldiers gone, just like that.
And only 50 of them actually fled France, so that leaves a lot unaccounted for. Makes you wonder, what's happening? What are they thinking? Are they disillusioned? Are they just afraid?
You think about the human cost of all this. I mean, we can talk about strategy and geopolitics all day, but ultimately there are real people caught in the crossfire.
Absolutely. And their stories are just as important as the grand narratives of this conflict. These are the individuals who are paying the price, bearing the brunt of the decisions made by those in power. We can't forget that.
We can't. And that brings us to some of the more difficult aspects of this conflict, the human toll. The documentaries you shared from the Kyiv Independent Team, they're really hard-hitting. I mean, that footage of Ukrainian soldiers using drones to target individual Russian soldiers, even potentially those who are already wounded, it's chilling.
It is, and it raises so many ethical questions about this new era of warfare. The psychological impact on the soldiers involve the trauma they must be enduring. These are things we need to grapple with as technology advances and warfare evolves.
It's easy to get lost in the big picture, the political maneuvering, the economic fallout, but we have to remember those individual stories. The medics in the documentary talking about their mental health struggles, the families torn apart. These are the real consequences of conflict.
Couldn't agree more. It's so important to keep that human perspective in mind.
Okay, so we've got this deep historical context, a broken trust with NATO expansion, a volatile situation in 2014, and then add to that mix the closure of that energy pipeline, the economic warfare, the psychological toll on those on the ground, and then we have to factor in reports of North Korean troops fighting alongside Russian forces.
It's a lot to unpack, for sure.
Yeah.
But it's crucial we try to understand each piece of this puzzle, right? How these elements connect and contribute to the overall picture of what's happening.
Exactly. And one of those pieces we need to examine is the potential for peace talks. Because President Zelensky, who made this interesting statement, he called Ukraine's incursion into the Russian Kursk region a very strong trump card in any negotiation.
Oh yeah, I picked up on that too. Trump card. It's a very deliberate choice of words, especially considering the new U.S. president who seems eager for a negotiated settlement. Makes you think about the messaging involved, right? Like how each side is trying to position themselves for potential talks.
Yeah, it's like a high-stakes game of chess. Every move is calculated, every statement carefully weighed.
It is. And with so many factors at play, Russia's economic woes, a new U.S. administration, Ukraine's determination to defend its territory, it really begs the question, what comes next? What's the most likely scenario for the future?
Yeah, what is next? It feels like we're at this critical turning point.
We are. And to understand what the future might hold, I think we need to dive deeper into those potential scenarios. Look at the possibilities for peace, the challenges that lie ahead, the risks of escalation, and that's exactly what we'll do in the next part of our deep dive.
You know, one thing that really struck me going through all this material was just how much warfare is changing. Especially with these drones, you know, it's a whole different ballgame now.
Yeah, the drones, I mean, it's like something out of science fiction, right?
Yeah.
These small unmanned aircraft wreaking havoc. And it's not just about capturing territory anymore.
Exactly. It's like we're entering this new era of warfare, and the rules are still being written. It's kind of unsettling, to be honest. It is unsettling, and the footage you shared from those Kyiv independent documentaries, it really brings it home, you know? Seeing those Ukrainian soldiers using FPV drones, like those first-person view drones, to target individual Russian soldiers.
Yeah, it's chilling stuff. And then you have the reports of them targeting wounded soldiers, potentially. Raises a lot of questions about the ethics of it all, right?
Huge ethical questions. I mean, do the Geneva Conventions even apply in this new landscape? Are we entering this gray area where the lines are blurred and anything goes?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? How do we define legitimate targets when you have this technology that allows for such precise and lethal strikes from miles away? And what about the psychological impact on the drone operators themselves? I mean,
Yeah.
they're witnessing death from afar. That can't be easy.
No, not at all. And one thing I read that really stuck with me was how Ukraine has been using fiber optic cables to control their drones. Apparently, it makes them much harder to jam, which just shows you how rapidly both sides are adapting and innovating.
Oh, absolutely. It's like a technological arms race out there. And it's not just about the drones themselves, but the strategies behind their use. We're seeing a shift from these large-scale military engagements to a more targeted approach, focusing on individual soldiers.
Which raises concerns about collateral damage, right?
Yeah.
And the erosion of those traditional warfare norms we've relied on.
Exactly. I mean, it blurs the lines between combatants and civilians, and that's a dangerous precedent.
It is. And it makes you think about the potential for misuse, right? I mean, this technology could easily fall into the wrong hands. And with AI-powered drones becoming more autonomous, well, that opens up a whole other can of worms.
No doubt about it. I mean, the idea of machines making life or death decisions on the battlefield without human oversight, it's terrifying. We're talking about accountability, proportionality, who's ultimately responsible. These are huge questions we need to be asking ourselves.
We do. And even beyond those big philosophical questions, there's the human cost. Those medics interviewed in the documentary, they spoke so candidly about the mental trauma they're facing. The nightmares, the flashbacks. It's a reminder that war leaves these invisible scars.
Oh, absolutely. And those scars can be just as debilitating as physical wounds. We need to be doing more to support these veterans, providing them with the mental health resources they need. They've witnessed and experienced things that most of us can't even imagine.
It's so easy to get caught up in the geopolitical chess game, the strategic maneuvering. But we can't forget the human beings at the heart of it all. Their stories are just as important.
More important, I'd argue, because at the end of the day, it's those individual stories that remind us of the true cost of war.
You're right. And it's not just the people on the front lines who are affected, right? The closure of that energy pipeline, for example, it's had such a huge impact on Europe, driving up gas prices and creating this whole energy crisis.
Exactly. And that's a perfect example of how interconnected our world is. A conflict in one region can have ripple effects that are felt globally. We're all connected in ways we might not even realize.
And then there's the issue of North Korea getting involved, even if it was temporary. Sending troops to fight alongside Russian forces, it's a reminder that this conflict could easily escalate beyond Ukraine's borders.
It's definitely a cause for concern. It raises questions about Russia's willingness to draw other actors into the conflict, about the potential for a wider war. It's a very slippery slope.
It is. And yet, amidst all this uncertainty, there's this push for peace talks, right?
Yeah.
Zelensky's statement about Ukraine's presence in Kursk being a trump card, it's intriguing.
It is. Like, was he trying to appeal to the new U.S. president who's been vocal about his desire for negotiations? It's a fascinating glimpse into the delicate dance of diplomacy, how each side tries to use language and strategy to their advantage.
It's like they're playing 4D chess or something. So many layers to it. So we've got Russia facing economic woes, a new U.S. administration eager for a negotiated settlement, and Ukraine showing incredible resilience and determination. Where do we go from here? What happens next?
That's the million-dollar question, right? And in the final part of our deep dive, we're going to try to answer it. We'll explore those potential scenarios for the future, the possibilities for peace, and the challenges that lie ahead. Because understanding where we might be headed is crucial for navigating the complexities of this conflict.
All right, so we've talked about the history, the geopolitics, the human cost. But what about the future? Where do we go from here? What are the potential scenarios?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And to be honest, there's no easy answer. There are so many variables, so many moving parts. But let's try to break it down a bit.
Okay, so one scenario that keeps popping up is escalation, right? The possibility that this conflict spills over Ukraine's borders and draws in other countries. How likely is that?
It's definitely a concern. We already saw the North Korean troops, even if it was brief.
Yeah.
And with the tension between Russia and the West, there's always a risk of things spiraling out of control.
One source even used the term black swan event. You know, an unpredictable event with potentially massive consequences. It's kind of scary to think about.
Yeah, black swan event. It's a good way to describe it. I mean, it could be anything, right? A cyber attack that cripples infrastructure, a military encounter that escalates beyond what anyone intended, even an accident involving nuclear weapons. The odds might be low, but the potential consequences are huge.
Yeah, that's not a thought I want to dwell on. So let's shift gears a bit and talk about something a little more hopeful, peace talks. Is there a realistic path towards a negotiated settlement?
Well, it's definitely possible. The new U.S. president seems eager to de-escalate things, and Russia, well, they're facing some serious economic pressure. Those factors could make both sides more willing to come to the table.
Okay, but there's still that deep mistrust, right? And those fundamentally different goals. Ukraine wants to maintain its sovereignty, its territory, and Russia wants those security guarantees, a buffer zone, no more NATO expansion. How do you bridge that gap?
It's not easy. It's going to require some serious compromises on both sides, and those compromises are going to be politically difficult, to say the least.
Some of the sources talked about potential territorial concessions from Ukraine, recognizing Russia's control of Crimea or the Donbas region. but that would be incredibly unpopular in Ukraine.
No, yeah, there would be huge backlash. Those territories are seen as integral parts of Ukraine, and giving them up would feel like a betrayal to many. It's not just about the land, it's about the principle of the thing.
I see. So what's the alternative? What happens if a negotiated settlement just isn't possible?
Well, one possibility is what's called a frozen conflict. Basically, the fighting dies down, but there's no formal peace agreement. It's like this state of suspended conflict with the potential for things to heat up again down the road.
So not really peace, but more like a pause button.
Exactly. It's not ideal, but it's happened before in other conflicts around the world. It would at least provide some relief from the violence, allow humanitarian aid to get through, and maybe create some space for dialogue in the future.
Okay, so even if we get a ceasefire or a frozen conflict, the road to reconciliation is going to be long and difficult, right? The wounds run deep on both sides.
Yeah, there's a lot of healing that needs to happen. Rebuilding trust after a conflict like this, it takes time and effort. You have to address the grievances, acknowledge past wrongs, and find ways to move forward together. It's a huge undertaking.
One expert in the sources posed this question that really stuck with me. If we look at this conflict through the lens of history, what lessons can we learn about the dangers of broken promises and the importance of understanding the motivations of all sides? What do you think?
That's a powerful question, and I think it highlights some key takeaways from this whole situation. First, international agreements are only as strong as the trust that underpins them. When promises are broken, the consequences can be devastating.
Yeah, and second, we can't just dismiss the other side's perspective. We have to try to understand their motivations, their fears, their historical context. It's not about agreeing with them, it's about empathizing and trying to see the world through their eyes.
Exactly. Without that empathy, without that willingness to understand, it's almost impossible to find common ground and build a lasting peace.
And I think it's also important to remember the human cost of this conflict.
Yeah.
The individuals and families whose lives have been shattered, the soldiers and medics struggling with trauma, the millions displaced from their homes.
We can't lose sight of that human dimension. It's a reminder that peace isn't just about treaties and borders. It's about creating a world where people feel safe, secure, and respected.
Well said. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to encourage everyone listening to keep learning, stay informed. This is a complex issue, and it's not going away anytime soon.
Absolutely. Engage in thoughtful conversations, consider different perspectives, and most importantly, don't lose hope. Even in the darkest of times, there's always a possibility for peace.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it's given you a better understanding of the Russia-Ukraine conflict and maybe even sparked some new thoughts and questions. We'll catch you next time.